So Donald Trump just kicked Canada out of NATO. And then when asked about the 457 Canadian soldiers who died in NATO operations, including 158 killed in Afghanistan fighting alongside American troops, he said, they earn nothing. Earn nothing. That's what the President of the United States, a man with 5 draft affirmants who has never served a day in uniform, said about soldiers who came home in flag-draped coffins. The outrage was immediate, and it didn't come from the usual places. It came from American generals who served with those Canadians in Kandahar, from Gold Star families, from the veterans of foreign wars, from Republican senators who did their tours in Afghanistan and know exactly what Canadian soldiers sacrificed. When you hear what they said and what Warren Buffett said about the cost of insulting the dead, when you hear the names of the soldiers Trump says earn nothing, the towns they came from, the missions they died on, the families they left behind, and when you understand what Canada's Prime Minister did on live television for 11 minutes in response, you'll understand why this isn't a trade war story anymore. This is a story about what happens when a man who has never sacrificed anything tells the dead they sacrificed nothing. Hit subscribe. Let me walk you through exactly what happened. Trump held a press conference in the Rose Garden to announce what the White House called the restoration of NATO alliance in decority, an executive directive formally withdrawing U.S. recognition of Canada as a NATO member in good standing. The directive ordered U.S. military commanders to suspend all cooperative operations with Canadian armed forces within 60 days, instructed the U.S. ambassador to NATO to introduce a resolution calling for Canada's formal suspension from alliance activities, and withdrew U.S. participation in NORAD joint operations, is pending a bilateral defense review. Now, legally, NATO has no expulsion mechanism. Article 13 allows voluntary withdrawal, but there's no provision for kicking a member out. Trump's directive has no legal force to actually remove Canada from the alliance, but the practical effects, suspending U.S. military cooperation with Canada, creates a de facto expulsion from the most critical operational dimensions of the alliance. If the U.S. refuses to cooperate with Canadian forces, Canada is functionally excluded, even if legally still a member. The prepared remarks were standard Trump grievances about defense spending, burden sharing, accusations that Canada was freeloading off American military power. Unremarkable, the kind of rhetoric he's directed at NATO allies for years. His national security advisor and the Secretary of State flanked him, both reportedly uncomfortable with the directive, but present for the announcement. And then a reporter asked the question that detonated everything. Mr. President Canada has lost 457 soldiers in NATO operations, including 158 inches Afghanistan. How do you justify expelling an ally that is paid in blood? Trump's response was unscripted, off the cuff, and devastating in its casual contempt. Canada sent soldiers to Afghanistan because we told them to. That was our war. They tagged along. They didn't do the heavy lifting. And look, people die in wars. It's sad, very sad. But you don't get to call yourself a NATO ally for 77 years because 150 of your soldiers died in a war we were running. That's not how this works. They didn't earn their seat at the table by losing people in Kandahar. They earned nothing. Let me unpack that because every line matters. Canada sent soldiers to Afghanistan because we told them to. This is false. Canada made an independent sovereign decision to deploy troops. The Canadian Parliament debated the deployment. Members of Parliament voted on it. No nation tells another nation to go to war. Canada chose to go because it believed in the alliance obligation. Because Article 5, the principle that an attack on one is an attack on all, was invoked by the United States on September 12, 2001, the day after the worst attack on American soil in history. And Canada answered, that was our war. They tagged along. Canada deployed more than 40,000 personnel to Afghanistan over 12 years. Canadian forces were assigned to Kandahar province. Not a safer area, not a support role, not a quiet sector. Kandahar was one of the most dangerous combat zones on earth. IEDs, ambushes, firefights, rocket attacks. Canadians were in the thick of it from 2006 onward, conducting offensive operations against Taliban forces in terrain where the survival margin was razor thin. This is not tagging along. They didn't do the heavy lifting. Canada's per capita combat death rate in Afghanistan was higher than most NATO allies, including several European nations with larger militaries. Canadian soldiers fought and died at rates that put them among the most committed combat forces in the theater. The heavy lifting was shared, and Canadians carried more than their weight. People die in wars. It's sad, very sad. That construction, very sad, is the phrase Trump uses for things he wants to move past, for things he doesn't actually care about. Applied to 158 combat deaths in a war zone where Canadian soldiers bled alongside Americans. It reads as contempt dressed in the thinnest possible clothing of sympathy. They didn't earn their seat at the table by losing people in Kandahar. They earned nothing. They earned nothing. The reporter followed up. Sir, are you saying Canadian soldiers who died in Afghanistan earned nothing? Trump doubled down. I'm saying that dying in a war doesn't mean your country gets a free pass on defense spending for the next 50 years. It doesn't work that way. In that moment, the National Security Advisor's face told the entire story. He didn't move. He didn't blink. But something behind his eyes shifted. The look of a man who understands in real time that the words just spoken cannot be unsaid and that the consequences will be profound. The press secretary was already moving toward the podium to end the conference. A Secret Service agent near the door shifted his weight, sensing the change in the room's energy, but the words were out. Broadcast live to every country on earth, recorded by every camera, captured by every microphone, permanent, and there is no walking them back. The room went silent. Not the silence of a dramatic moment at a political event, the silence of shock of people who cover politics for a living, who have heard thousands of presidential statements suddenly confronting something outside the range of anything they've experienced. Several reporters looked down at their notebooks. One put her hand over her mouth. The press secretary ended the conference within 2 minutes, but the damage was measured in seconds, not minutes. In the time it took Trump to say those sentences, roughly 40 seconds of speech, he had created a rupture that no subsequent statement, no clarification, no retraction could close. In 30 years of covering presidents, Washington press corps veterans said they'd seen press conferences go sideways. They'd seen gaffes and misstatements and moments that staffers scrambled to walk back before the evening news. But they'd never seen a press room go that quiet because everyone in that room understood what had just happened. The president had just told the dead they earn nothing. And some things once said exist forever. Now, let me tell you about the people Trump says has earned nothing. Corporal Andrew Greenan was 23 years old, a member of the Royal 22nd Regiment, the Van Canada's storied French-speaking regiment, one of the most decorated units in Canadian military history. He grew up in a small town in Quebec, the kind of place where everyone knows your family and the hardware store owner asks about your mother. He joined the military at 19 because he wanted to serve, not because he couldn't find a job, not because he had no other options, because he believed that service meant something. He was killed on September 3rd of 2008 when his vehicle struck an improvised explosive device in the Zari district of Kandahar province. He'd been in country for 3 months. He was supposed to come home in December. His mother told the CBC he wanted to serve. He believed in the mission. He believed he was making a difference. At his funeral, his entire regiment stood at attention while his coffin was carried by 6 soldiers who had trained with him since basic. Corporal Andrew Greenan earned nothing. According to the President of the United States, Captain Nicola Goddard was 26 years old, a forward observation officer with the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery. She was brilliant, sharp, dedicated. Her commanding officer later said she was one of the most capable officers he had ever served with. On May 17, 2006, during Operation Medusa, one of the largest NATO offensive operations of the Afghanistan war, her forward observation position was hit by Taliban RPG fire. She was calling in artillery coordinates to protect Canadian and Afghan soldiers when she was killed. She was the first Canadian female combat soldier killed in action since the Second World War. Her husband, Jason, later said she died doing exactly what she trained to do, protecting her soldiers by directing fire on enemy positions. He kept her wedding ring. He visits her grave every year on the anniversary. Captain Nicola Goddard earned nothing. According to the president, Master Corporal Crystal Geiserek was 34 years old, a military medic serving with the Health Services Support Company. She was known among her unit as the person who would stay up all night with a wounded soldier, the one who remembered everyone's birthday, the one who wrote letters home for soldiers too exhausted to hold a pen. On the 26th of June, 2010, she was killed by a roadside bomb in Kandahar province. At the time of the blast, she was treating wounded Afghan civilians, not soldiers. Civilians, women and children caught in a crossfire that wasn't their fight. She was providing medical aid to people who had nothing to do with the war when the IED detonated. A medic healing the wounded killed in the act of caring for others. Master Corporal Crystal Jizarek earned nothing, according to the president. 3 names out of 457. 3 lives out of 457. 3 families that got the phone call no military family ever wants to receive. 3 funerals with a flag-draped coffin and a bugler playing the last post. 3 headstones in Canadian military cemeteries visited every November by parents who are growing older, by children who are growing up without a mother or father, by friends who never stop missing them, and according to the President of the United States, 3 people who earn nothing. When the bodies of fallen Canadian soldiers were repatriated from Afghanistan, their remains were transported by motorcade from Canadian Forces Base Trenton to the coroner's office in Toronto along Highway 401, 170 kilometers of Canadian highway. And spontaneously, without any organization or coordination, Canadians began standing on the overpasses, thousands of them in silence, holding flags, some saluting, some in tears, some holding photographs of the soldiers they'd come to honor. Firefighters parked their trucks on the bridges and held Canadian flags over the road as the convoy passed beneath. Children stood beside their parents and watched the nation grieve. The tradition grew with every repatriation. By the end of the Afghanistan mission, entire communities would drive hours to stand on a single overpass for the few seconds it took the motorcade to pass beneath. Construction workers would stop their machinery. Commuters would pull their cars to the shoulder and stand beside their vehicles, hand over heart. In winter, people stood in sub-zero temperatures, snow falling on their shoulders, because the cold didn't matter. What mattered was being present. What mattered was the soldier beneath the flag and the hearse below, knowing if the dead can know anything, that a nation was watching and a nation was grateful. In 2007, the stretch of highway was officially renamed the Highway of Heroes. The Highway of Heroes is not a metaphor. It is a physical place. 170 kilometers of Canadian highway where a nation stood in silence and told its dead, "We see you, we honor you, you earned everything." Every Canadian who stood on those overpasses understood, without anyone needing to explain it, that the soldier passing beneath them had given something that could never be repaid. And they stood there anyway in the cold and the rain and the silence, because standing was the only thing they could give in return. That is what Trump said earned nothing. Beyond Afghanistan, the 457 include Canadian soldiers who served and died across NATO's entire seven-year history. In Bosnia, Kosovo, Libya, and dozens of other operations that most Americans have never heard of. In 1993, Canadian soldiers fought the Battle of Medak Pocket, the largest Canadian ground engagement since Korea, clearing Croatian forces that had attacked Serbian civilians in a brutal ethnic cleansing campaign. The Canadians advanced under fire, took positions, and held them while the world debated. 4 Canadians were wounded. The operation saved hundreds of civilian lives and was largely unreosnixed internationally for years. In 2011, when NATO decided to intervene in Libya, it was a Canadian general, Lieutenant General Charles Bouchard, who was chosen to command the entire operation. Not an American, not a British or French general, a Canadian. Operation Unified Protector, commanded by Canada, flew thousands of sorties and helped prevent a massacre in Benghazi. Canada didn't tag along. Canada led today, right now, as these words are being spoken. More than 2,000 Canadian soldiers are deployed in Latvia as the framework nation for NATO's multinational battle group on the alliance's eastern flank. They are there as a tripwire against Russian aggression, standing between Vladimir Putin's military ambitions and the sovereign borders of the Baltic states. They volunteered for this deployment. They left their families. They serve in a country far from home because the alliance asked and Canada answered, the way Canada's always answered. Every operation, every deployment, every mission NATO asked for, Canada showed up. And 457 times showing up cost a life. Prime Minister Carney's response was not a speech. It was not a policy rebuttal. It was not a diplomatic counterstrike. It was something else entirely. He stood at a podium in Ottawa, looked directly into the camera, and said, "I will not dignify the president's insult to our fallen with the response it deserves. Instead, I will say their names." And for 11 minutes, on live television broadcast to every country on earth, Carney read the names of fallen Canadian soldiers slowly, clearly, one name at a time, a pause after each one. No commentary, no argument, no rebuttal, no anger, no tears, though his voice wavered twice. Once near the name of a soldier from his own writing, and once near the end when the weight of 457 names pressed visibly on his composure, just names. And in those names, in the silence between them, was the only answer the insult ever needed. News anchors around the world stopped talking. They let the feed run. CNN carried it live without interruption. The BBC carried it. Al Jazeera carried it. Networks that normally cut away from foreign press conferences let Carney read every name because the producers understood instinctively that cutting away would be wrong, that the names demanded to be heard, that the silence between them was the most powerful political statement of the year. 11 minutes of names. It was the most devastating response in the history of this trade war. And Carney didn't say a single word of his own. The outrage that followed was immediate, universal, and crossed every political line that exists. In Canada, Parliament passed a unanimous resolution condemning the insult. Every party, every member, 0 abstentions. The resolution was introduced by the leader of the opposition, not by the governing party, a deliberate signal that this was not partisan. It was national. The vote took less than 4 minutes. No debate was needed. Canadian veterans organizations, the Royal Canadian Legion, Afghanistan veterans groups, peacekeeping associations issued statements describing the insult as a knife in the heart of every family that buried a soldier. The response in Canada was immediate and deeply personal. The national president of the Royal Canadian Legion, himself an Afghanistan veteran, spoke with quiet authority. The President of the United States said, "Our fallen soldiers earned nothing." I stood at the ramp ceremonies. I watched their coffins come off the aircraft. I looked their families in the eye. Those soldiers earned more than any politician has the right to judge. Across the country, Canadians began gathering again on the overpasses of the Highway of Heroes, the same bridges where citizens once stood to honor returning soldiers from Afghanistan. Many held photographs of the fallen, others raised small flags or signs that simply read, "They earned everything." Within hours, spontaneous crowds appeared in Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, Calgary, Halifax, and Winnipeg, not organized by political groups or social media campaigns, but by ordinary Canadians defending the honor of their dead. In Ottawa, a crowd gathered quietly outside the Embassy of the United States, Ottawa, and stood in complete silence. The silence itself became the protest. The outrage soon crossed the border. Retired American generals who had fought alongside Canadian forces in Kandahar province publicly defended their allies, with one commander stating that Canadian soldiers fought bravely in some of the war's hardest battles and that dismissing their sacrifice insulted every soldier who served there. The veterans of foreign wars also issued a rare and forceful statement declaring that Canadian troops who died alongside Americans earned the deepest respect of every U.S. service member and that their sacrifice was sacred. Gold Star families echoed the same sentiment, with one American mother saying her son survived an ambush because a Canadian soldier drew enemy fire, an act that cost him his life. Within 24 hours, leaders from across the North Atlantic Treaty Organization alliance responded. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom called the remark beneath the dignity of the presidency, while officials in France and Germany emphasized that Canadian blood had been shed in defense of the alliance for decades. Even Australia, not a NATO member, issued a statement honoring Canadian sacrifice. The NATO Secretary General delivered one of the strongest rebukes in the alliance's history, reminding the world that NATO was built on shared sacrifice and that every fallen soldier from every member nation had earned the alliance's eternal gratitude. 31 nations spoke in defense of Canada's fallen. Only one government remained silent, the one whose president had sparked the outrage.